Shemini. This week's reading, Shemini, is a continuation of the previous week's reading, Tzav, where we learned about the tabernacle's 7-day inaugural ceremony. This week's reading opens on the 8th day when God's presence descends upon the tabernacle. On that day, Aaron's sons, Nadav and Avihu, die while offering an uncalled for incense sacrifice. The portion concludes with a discussion about the laws of kosher and ritual purity. Shemini means eighth. So, for example, the very famous verse that tells us to circumcise says, Uvayoim hashmini yemel b'sar lose, and on the 8th day you shall circumcise the flesh. So, Shemini, very simply, means eighth. The layout of this Parsha, especially since it picks up where last week's Parsha leaves off, seems a little odd. In essence, we finish last week's Parsha with an unconcluded narrative. There are 7 days of inauguration or practice, as it were, apprenticeship, some translate it as. And then those 7 days are to lead into the 8th day, which really is the beginning of the functioning of the tabernacle in its full glory. And so if you've started that narrative in last week's Torah portion, it's a little odd that you don't conclude it in last week's Torah portion. You end that Torah portion, and then for a week we have to wait, as it were, until we get to next Shabbat, namely this coming Shabbat, and then we pick up all of a sudden on the 8th day. But that really is certainly not a mistake. It is very much appropriate and on purpose, because as much as the 8th day seems to be the continuation of the narrative after the initial 7 days, there is a fundamental distinction between the number 7 and the number 8. The number 7, whether in the sense of 7 days of the week, or 7 days of the sabbatical or Shemitah cycle, or when we look at geometry, for example, that there are 7 concentric circles that can come together to form a shape as opposed to 6 or 8. The number 7 bespeaks order and nature. The number 8, being one above 7, is therefore bespeaking of transcendence of limitation and transcendence of nature. And so it's not by coincidence that it's on the 8th day when we have the circumcision for a baby boy, because the whole idea of circumcision is a covenant that is entered into that transcends conditions. Whether or not that child continues on the right path, following God and serving God, as the covenant would seem to indicate, he still is circumcised, even if he becomes a wicked idolater, murderer, who knows what. And that's because the basis of that covenant is transcendent of those kinds of limitations. And whenever we see the number 8, whether it's in the context of the offerings, an animal cannot be younger than 8 days old before being able to be offered. In any context, when we see the number 8, whether it's Hanukkah, it's always about transcendence in whatever particular context. That is the case in this scenario as well. The 7 days, of course, are going to be the first step of the practical happenings in the tabernacle. And then, of course, after those 7 days, we're going to have the 8th day. But they are actually not one narrative, even though, obviously, chronologically, they're one continuous spectrum. The 8th day is fundamentally different than the first 7 days. Namely, the first 7 days are practice, and inasmuch as there are the same actions done, performed in the tabernacle, they actually have no spiritual effect, not nearly in the same way, or even qualitatively not in the same way, as what occurred on the 8th day. And therefore, this Parsha picks up with the 8th day because it's actually something that's brand new. That being the case, the 8th day and the concept of 8 or 8th being something that bespeaks transcendence, we somehow have to remember that the entirety of the Parsha is named and under the banner of whatever is gleaned from the very beginning of the Parsha. The name practically of any Parsha comes from the very, very beginning, first couple of verses at the latest. But nevertheless, it's the name of the entire Torah portion, and every major component of the entire unit that is the Torah portion has to somehow fit under that general description, under that general banner. So when we look at the three main components of this Torah portion, obviously the 8th day of the tabernacle's functioning, that we've already explained how that's transcendent. The second main component is the passing of Nadav and Avihu, of the two older sons of Aaron. And we see there, as we'll get into, of course, when we get into the actual Aliyah, that their passing was because they transcended, or wanted, as it were, to transcend human limitations in serving God. And so their passing, as tragic as it was actually in a miraculous way. And the final main component of the Torah portion is that of kosher. And when we take a look at the general categorization of all of the commandments, whether a particular commandment falls under statutes or testimonials or judgments, kosher, many commandments by the way, not just one, kosher is a category of commandments, that entire category about don't eat pork and don't eat that, meat and dairy, etc., all of that falls under the category of statutes, things that we do not understand, things that God did not explain, and so we're left with doing them pretty much because God said so, and that's it. Again, transcendent of reason. The first Aliyah. Moses gathers all the Jews to the tabernacle to witness the divine presence descending upon the sanctuary on that day. This particular day that we're discussing, of course, is the 8th day, as we said. But in addition to being the 8th day, which, again, in and of itself is also important, the sages tell us that this particular day had 10 special things about it. And 2 of the 10 that are highlighted is that it was the first day of the days of creation, namely it was a Sunday, and it was the first day of the month. It was Rosh Chodesh Nisan, the first day of the month of Nisan. The commentaries ask why it's so important that these 2 special characteristics are highlighted in general, and especially in the context of the erection of the tabernacle. Again, this day is special first and foremost because it's the 8th day, the day when the tabernacle was no longer just a training facility, but when it actually was erected with a divine flame that comes down, consumes the offerings, and all of the functions as actually commanded happen. The idea of the Mishkan, the idea of the tabernacle, is in essence a practical continuation of what occurred at Sinai. At Sinai, the Jewish people, of course, gathered at the mountain. God descends onto the mountain and Moses ascends. And then, of course, God gives us the Torah. God's descent onto the mountain is the very first time since the Garden of Eden. So for 26 generations, there's this massive gap. And finally, there is once again the actual presence of God in the physical world. Not just an angel, not emanation, not prophecy, but actual physical presence in a physical world for an infinite spiritual being, for God. Obviously, those are pretty much polar opposites: infinity, infinitude, spirituality, and physicality. But the whole idea of Sinai, the whole idea of the Torah, is the combination of those 2 things. That's why the sages say that the Torah was given for no reason other than to make peace in the world. There are many things in Torah that are very peaceful and beautiful, but there are many things in Torah that are a little bit on the harsh side, a little bit on the violent side, you might even say. War, death penalty, all sorts of other corporal punishments, etc. What kind of peace are we talking about? The definition of peace is very often misconstrued. It is not 2 countries or 2 people or 2 entities which are at some point in conflict, and then, peace is declared and they are no longer in conflict. The reason why that's really not the proper definition of peace is because the fact that they were in conflict at some point doesn't mean that they are fundamentally conflicted. It means that at some point conditions were such that it didn't work out between them. And then when they are no longer in conflict, conditions have changed. They realize that it's not worth the fight, and so they stop fighting. The real definition of peace, like the real definition of anything, comes from a verse in the Torah. We have a famous verse that we actually know from prayer, not as much as from the verse, Oseh Shalom Bimromav. Oseh Shalom Bimromav is actually a clause in a verse in Job, and we know it from Oseh Shalom Bimromav, Hu Yaseh Shalom Aleinu Ve'al Kol Yisrael V'Yimro Amen, from Kaddish, for example. So he who makes peace in his heavens, he should make peace for us and for all of Israel, and let us say Amen. That's the prayer. The actual clause from the verse is that first phrase, he who makes peace in his heavens. And so the commentaries ask a very simple question. Who's fighting in heaven that God should have to make peace there? Obviously, the only entities in heaven are angels. Angels only ever do whatever God says. They are, in essence, like spiritual robots. They don't have free will to choose whether or not to follow God. And obviously, if they're only following God and only capable of following God, they shouldn't really ever be fighting. And so the commentaries, in fact, explain that there are 2 legions of angels that pretty much all the angels fall into. 1 legion serves God out of love and kindness, and 1 legion serves God out of severity and judgment. Those 2 are polar opposites, fundamentally opposed. What God allows to happen, this is what it means that God makes peace in his heavens, is that he allows both legions to serve him at the same time while maintaining their individual and opposing characteristics. That is the definition of peace. To put together 2 polar opposites and allow them at the same time to maintain their opposing identities. And that's what Torah does. Torah allows for the spiritual and the physical, polar opposites, to be able to be combined while maintaining their opposing identities through the commandments that are, of course, found in the Torah. A commandment, on the one hand, is a spiritual endeavor, it's God's will. On the other hand, it is a physical, practical act with a physical object. Obviously, it's both spiritual and physical, therefore, Torah is given for no reason other than to make peace. The Sinai experience, as powerful as it was, only basically lasts for a couple of hours, right? At the very early morning of the 6th of Sivan, God comes down onto the mountain, Moses goes up to the mountain, we have the giving of the Torah. And then Moses goes back further up the mountain for 40 days, etc. And the rest of the experience at Sinai, to some extent, is still very spiritually powerful. Of course, there's the entire misstep of the golden calf, but the real kind of what we think of as Sinai experience is over within a few hours. To maintain and to continue God's physical presence in a physical world, he says, make for me a sanctuary, the osuli mikdash, the shochanti b'seichem, and I will dwell amongst them, or within them. That is, first and foremost, the tabernacle, and eventually the temple. Once that tabernacle is built, and once that tabernacle is established and erected, then there is a physical place in the world where the divine, spiritual, infinite presence is found. Again, polar opposites, basically Sinai and continued. Therefore, we have to have an element of the day when that tabernacle is erected that is all about the spiritual. On the other hand, we have to have a day when it's all about the physical. The first day of creation, Sunday, is when this particular day is, and on the very first day of creation, meaning at the very, very beginning of human history, of world history, everything is created. The common misconception is that on Sunday, only light was created, and then on the day and night, and then the second day was the firmament, and the third day was something else. That's actually not true. When we look at a few particularities in the verse, we see, and certainly from the sages, we see that everything was created on the first day, except for the human being, and was placed in its particular role, was placed in its particular space, as it were, in the universe on whichever subsequent day. So really, Sunday is the day when everything physical is made. So the fact that this day was a Sunday represents all of physical creation. On the other hand, it was Rosh Chodesh. The whole idea of a new month, especially from the Hebrew perspective, Chodesh, meaning month, is related to the Hebrew word chidush, which means innovation or renewing, is that it's something new. That's the reference to the spiritual side of things, something that is not like anything before, rather something completely new, something that transcends the physical, namely the spiritual. The fact that this occurrence, the erection and final kind of dedication of the tabernacle, occurs on both a Sunday and a Rosh Chodesh is because that's what the whole idea of a tabernacle is all about. The spiritual side and the physical side all together. Aaron offers various sacrifices in preparation for this revelation. The second Aliyah. After concluding the offering of all the sacrifices, Aaron blesses the people with the priestly blessing. The priestly blessing continues this same idea. When we look at the priestly blessing, which is not stated in our Parsha, but of course is stated in the Torah, and we actually recite it every single morning as part of the morning blessings, and of course it's also recited in the context of communal prayer when we have the repetition of the Amidah, and certainly on holidays when we have the Kohanim who actually bless the people, we see that the priestly blessing is not one blessing, but rather three. The first is the verse which says, Yivarechecha Hashem v'yishmerecha, may God bless you and protect you, or guard you. The second is Yoer Hashem ponav elecha v'chuneka, may God shine his countenance, his face upon you and give you grace. And the final one is Yisa Hashem ponav elecha v'yasim lecha shalom, may God raise or lift his countenance upon you and give you peace. The commentaries very simply point out that these three are in fact two combined into one. The very first of the three, may God bless you and protect you, is specifically a reference to material blessings. And the way that we know is because it needs protection. May God bless you and protect you or guard you. The kind of blessing that needs guarding. A person is blessed in some kind of a material way. He has a new house, physical health. That needs guarding because something can damage those things. If we were talking about a spiritual blessing, that really doesn't need guarding as much. Spirituality is acorporeal, it's not something that it's tangible, and so you can't really be damaged in a way that could be prevented by guarding. So the fact that the first clause references blessing together with guarding means that it's the kind of blessing that needs guarding. So that's the physical. The second clause, may God shine his countenance upon you and give you grace. The reference of grace, especially in the context of the prophets, is specifically spirituality. So whereas the first clause, the first blessing was physical, material, the second is spiritual. The third one has that special, famous word that we just said, peace. May God raise his countenance upon you and give you peace. Peace, again, is the combination of two polar opposites. The previous two clauses or verses, the previous two were physical and spiritual. So in the same way that the days themselves line up for the sake of the tabernacle to do what it's supposed to do, the blessing that Aaron blesses the Jewish people with once this has been accomplished, once the tabernacle has been erected, is again the very, very same concept. Moses and Aaron bless the Jewish people that God's presence dwell in their handiwork, and indeed the divine presence visibly descends upon the tabernacle. The third Aliyah. At this point, a heavenly fire descends and consumes the offerings on the altar. This has not happened since the very beginning of when the altar was put there and the tabernacle was put up. All of the offerings have been brought in those 7 inaugural days, 7 days of practice or apprenticeship. But the only fire that ever consumed them was the actual fire that the Kohanim put together with the wood of the altar and did what they were supposed to do, but there was no spiritual response. So once there is a spiritual response, there seems to be no need for us, or really for the Kohanim specifically, to put the fire together on their end. In other words, maybe if you look at it as starting a grill for a barbecue, yeah, of course you have to put the lighter fluid on the coals. But once those coals catch, and once they're hot, and once they're going, you don't need to keep putting lighter fluid on. The fire is there, you start cooking, and that's it. So here, once the flame from heaven comes down and is already consuming the offerings, why do the Kohanim need to continue to make sure that there is that wood inside of the belly or opening of the altar in order that there should be a physical fire? The heavenly fire comes down and it remains there in a miraculous way. Even when the tabernacle was being transported, the heavenly flame was said to kind of dwell within a particular coal or ember in the opening of the altar, and miraculously would light back up once the new positioning of the tabernacle was found and the whole thing was re-erected. So once it's there, it doesn't seem to be necessary for us to do anything. But once again, in the same vein as we've already discussed, the whole idea of the tabernacle is the combination of the spiritual and the physical, from above down to below, that's from the spiritual down, and from below up to above, from the physical up. Yes, it's true that there is a divine flame, and it's miraculous, and it's always there. That's fine and good, but that's what God does. We need to do our part because we are to be active partners and participants with God in this union. And therefore we, the Kohanim specifically again, were always to make sure that the fire of the altar was properly maintained by making sure that there was that wood that was there every single day. Aaron's eldest two sons, Nadav and Avihu, bring an unauthorized incense offering, and a heavenly fire consumes them. The heavenly fire that consumes them does not burn them in the sense that you would imagine, some kind of a fire like that consumed the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah, Sodom and Amorah. And we know this from the very next thing that happens. Moses orders the removal of their bodies from the tabernacle and instructs Aaron and his remaining two sons not to observe the traditional laws of mourning, considering that they had to continue serving in the sanctuary on behalf of the Jewish people. If a fire consumed them, then what bodies are there to remove? In fact, their bodies were completely intact, not damaged in any way. Their clothes weren't even singed, and yet a fire came down and consumed them. The sages explained that this was a miraculous occurrence. The fire that came down and consumed them actually split into two strings for each of them, so four altogether, entered their nose, their nostrils, and basically sucked out and brought back on high their souls. In the very same way that in creating man, God put together a body and then breathed soul into that body through the nostrils, something that was not the case for any other creation. Animals, he said, let there be animals. Birds, let there be birds. Fish, let there be whatever it is. For man, he put him together on the physical side, an actual body, and then he breathed a soul into him because man is made of those two components. So in this scenario, that fire came down and took back the soul, and the souls ascended on high. And the bodies were left. They were not burned in the traditional understanding at all. Again, their clothes weren't even singed. It's a little strange that there should be a miraculous and actually quite spiritual form of death for these two people who obviously did something wrong, otherwise they wouldn't have been punished by being put to death. So which one is it? Did they do something wrong and then they should have suffered a regular death or some kind of a physical, maybe even painful death? Or did they somehow deserve this very special and spiritual and miraculous death? And then why is it that they're considered to have done something wrong? There are in fact different aspects, different levels of explanation as to what they did wrong. That they did something wrong is very clear. because again, they were punished by the fact that they passed away. However, when we go through all of the levels of explanation as to what they did wrong, we see one common denominator. The simple meaning of the verse, as it says here in the summary, is that they brought an unauthorized incense offering. An offering that wasn't commanded, they just decided of their own accord to bring. Specifically an incense offering. Of all the different kinds of offerings that there are, animal, bird, vegetation, wine libation, whatever, the incense offering is in fact the holiest. One of the ways that we know that is that on the holiest day of the year, on Yom Kippur, when the holiest person in the world, the Kohen Gadol, goes into the holiest place in the world, the Kodesh HaKodashim, the Holy of Holies, he goes in there for basically one service on Yom Kippur, and that is the bringing of the incense offering. So it's the holiest offering that there is. They want it to be holy. Regardless of the fact that it wasn't commanded, they decided that their desire to be holy is what matters, and so they brought this unauthorized incense offering. The Torah portion, or I should say the Torah paragraph that comes right after this particular narrative is the prohibition of serving for a Kohen while drunk. A Kohen who has drunk more than a revis, more than 3.2 fluid ounces of wine, cannot serve in the tabernacle or temple, lest he not know whether his service is properly done or improperly done. The fact that that is the very next paragraph in the whole of the Torah, right after the passing of these two sons of Aaron, the sages tell us is not by mistake and not by coincidence, but is very much on purpose. It's to tell us that they had actually consumed wine before entering the tabernacle and bringing this unauthorized incense offering. And so, immediately after the narrative, to show you what kind of an effect, what kind of a negative result such an action can have, there's that codification of that prohibition. Why would they, or any other Kohen for that matter, drink wine and then go serve? Our sages tell us that when wine goes in, secrets come out. And the implication there is when one has a little bit of l'chaim, as we saw in Purim and as we see in a regular, perfectly kosher and even holy environment, a person is a little bit less inhibited in his desire and in his readiness to devote himself to serving God. When we quell the influence of the animal soul with a little bit of mashka, or in this case a little bit of wine, the godly soul can come out a little bit more. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's a very holy thing when done in the right way. Nevertheless, with all of that desire notwithstanding, it's wrong in the context of the service in the tabernacle. But again, Nadav and Avihu, these two sons of Aaron, they wanted to be that much more spiritual, and so they drank wine and then they went to serve. Another explanation given by our sages is that they adjudicated Torah law, halacha, in front of Moses and Aaron. There is a scenario where a particular person comes and asks a question about offerings and impurity, and they know the law, and so they answer, and they answer correctly. But because they answered while in the presence of Moses and Aaron, their father and their rabbi, their teacher, that in and of itself is wrong. They, by law, had to wait, and either Moses and Aaron would have answered that person or would have deferred, and then they could answer once that deferral had occurred. But they didn't wait. They wanted to make sure that this person knew what God wanted of him. Specifically, what the impurity, purity, offerings, etc. situation was. And so they answered, and they answered correctly. But nevertheless, because they didn't have that check to their desire, they are said to have sinned.